These videos are going to be talking about chapter 24 in our textbook, so the Great Depression and the New Deal, which was FDR's plan to respond to the Great Depression. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the underlying causes of the crash. I just realized I made this video a couple years back when I was teaching a push for the first time, and I made silly little animations, but I think I stopped them eventually. So in any case, normally the most heavily associated cause of the Great Depression is the crash in 1929 of the stock market. But as we discussed in our conversations about the 1920s, we know that that is a little bit of a understatement, that there were definitely signs of weakness in the economy, particularly in the agricultural sector. You did have signs of overproduction going into it, and ultimately what we see is that by the late 20s, finally some of these some of this sort of overspending caught up with the economy. And in addition to that, what happened with the crash was ultimately, at the beginning at least, a typical cycle of boom-bust economics, right? The economy tends to rise and fall in sort of a natural pattern, but because you had some exacerbated activities in the 1920s, when the market did crash, people panicked and ultimately overreacted. And that's one of the reasons why we reached such a market low by 1932. But in any case, the reasons why the market reached the point that it did and ultimately crashed was due to a number of problems. So, we know, looking into Black Tuesday, sort of the moment when the market really starts to tank, you see that there's this precipitous increase in stock market values. And ultimately, it's important for us to realize that this increase is somewhat artificial. And this is because so many people were investing in the stock market, all thinking that the boom would last, right? But I mean, ultimately, there obviously has to be a peak and it will start dropping, right? So a lot of the values of the stock were actually sort of overinflated because as people continued to purchase it, the value wouldn't increase. But it didn't actually mean that the company that the stocks were based in was doing any better, right? So basically, the values of stocks were overinflated. And another major problem was this thing called buying on the margin, which was something that was very risky. Essentially, if you were interested in buying stocks, you would not have to put up the entire 100% of the stock market value. Buying on the margin meant that you could buy your stock by just paying a fraction of the stock value. So let's say 10%. Right? The idea was that you were supposed to pay back your stockbroker the full price with interest eventually. But your assumption, if you think about this upward trend of the market, would be, say, okay, you were buying $100 worth of stock, right? And if you bought it on the margin, you would pay $10 for it. Your expectation would be that eventually the price would double in value, right? So you'd basically have $200 worth of stock. Then you would have easily enough money to pay back your broker with the interest, and you would continue to profit, right? So people were buying on margin, again, just with the expectation that the market would continue to rise. When the market declined, the problem was that people would still owe all the money that their stock was originally worth, even if the value decreased, right? So if you bought $100 worth of stock and then the value declined to like $50, you would still owe your broker $100. And the real problem is that you don't have any of that money because you only had $10 to put down on the stock to begin with, right? So buying on margin was incredibly risky, and it was definitely exacerbating the conditions of the stock market. And also, just in general, the stock market was a good example of speculation. We have already talked about speculation in the context of purchasing land. The same exact concept applies to buying stocks, right? Many people were investing in the stock market only to sell it again when the price went up, right? Just like buying a home and then, doing something to it, selling it off, right? Your assumption always is that the value is going to increase again, but this is clearly risky, right? So over speculation in the stock market was also a huge, huge cause of the crash. But regardless, I just want to highlight the idea that the stock market is not the singular cause of the depression. In fact, many people argue that it did not cause the depression at all, but rather it reflected the current economic condition of the country, that it was far worse than anyone actually imagined it to be. And ultimately, the actual depression was much more of a reaction to the realities of the economy. The depression was not an immediate effect of the stock market crash, rather. The stock market crash just sort of brought to the attention the major underlying problems of the economy that had existed for quite some time. Okay, so basically I wanted to highlight sort of an economic cycle that is taking place, again, that is sort of exacerbating the conditions of the Great Depression. And so, as you probably know, one of the major indicators that the economy was depressed was the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate was approximately, well, in a good estimate, meaning like an optimistic one, was about 25%. But by 1933, most statistics argue that the unemployment rate was more like 1/3 of the entire population. So if 1 in every 3 people in the workforce are unemployed, obviously that's a very, very high number. And it was even higher among minorities. So African Americans, for example, the unemployment rate was more like 50%. And so when you have a lot of unemployment, there are increasing problems that go along with that. Obviously, if there aren't enough people working, they're not producing as much, right? You ultimately are cutting positions in factories, for example. So you don't have as much of an end product, right? So if unemployment rises, the general industrial productivity declines, right? Also, if you have people that are both unemployed and the idea is that not enough things are produced, there isn't enough purchasing power in the country. So in other words, people don't have enough extra money ultimately to go out and buy things. And even if they wanted to, these things aren't being produced because productivity is down. So this ultimately outlines this general economic cycle that made the conditions of the Depression increasingly worse, right? As unemployment continued to climb, it was much more difficult for anyone ultimately to do anything to get themselves out of this rut, right? One of the major things that helps alleviate economic recessions and depressions is to increase spending, right? To just kind of get money back into circulation. But if no one had a job, and if there weren't enough products being produced to begin with, no one really has an incentive to do this. So the economy continued to decline. All right. So another major thing that's happening is that when the stock market declines, when these speculations suddenly are, when people suddenly realize that they're not going to make money off of these speculations anymore, people start to panic and try to get their money out of the bank, right? But the problem is that the bank ultimately is relying on deposits, right? It feels that ultimately it depends on consumer confidence, right? So people put money in the bank kind of thinking that they're going to be able to get it back on the other end, right? Whereas banks also are assuming that people are going to continue to put their money in it. So when suddenly there's this increased unemployment, when the stock market also crashes, people are no longer putting money in the bank. So basically, banks don't have enough money in circulation for them to pay back people who have borrowed money from them, right? So by relying on deposits, banks basically are unable to actually repay all these major loans that they have issued, right? They're trying to recall loans that are bad. In other words, like people who ultimately probably should not have taken out the loans to begin with. They're unable to pay them off. So basically, banks aren't able to take in any money from anyone who's borrowed from them. So what ultimately happens is there are these bank panics, bank failures. People sometimes lose their entire savings at a bank. Banks, many of them are forced to close their doors. And what the major effect of this is that consumers in general don't trust the bank system anymore. They would rather hoard their money under a mattress, as this animation suggests, than actually put their money in a bank because they think that there's a huge risk that their money will be loaned out to someone and they won't be able to get it back. And that was true to a certain extent because at this point there was no federal protection of your money in a bank, right? So the general sense of confidence was very low, both by the unemployment that we previously mentioned, but also just by the fact that these major banks are ultimately failing and people are losing their life savings. So again, this cycle rears its ugly head. The idea that having high unemployment, low production, and also very few people are actually going out and spending money. This is ultimately what leads to the Depression. Okay, so Hoover is also blamed quite a bit for exacerbating the Depression. The idea is that he maybe could have acted more to respond to it, and ultimately he did not, right? So one thing, of course, is that the unemployment level was at such a massive scale that Hoover and the other previous Republicans who'd been in office in the 1920s, their only traditional form of relief that the federal government could accommodate was normally through the Federal Reserve System, right? The Federal Reserve System could issue loans in a time of crisis. But the problem was that the Federal Reserve System could not issue loans to every single bank that failed and every single business that failed. It just simply did not have those resources. And so somebody like Hoover was not necessarily not necessarily completely unreacting. That's not a word. He wasn't completely standing idly by and not doing anything about the Depression. But the forms of economic relief that currently were on the books in the federal government were just not enough to accommodate this massive unemployment scale and this massive level of debt. You also just in general had this lack of confidence because so often the people who became unemployed were the traditional breadwinners. So by shattering the idea that you can provide for your family, there's a general sense of, there's a lack of confidence as well. It's not just the fact that, that the economy is in a depression. It's much more it's not so much that people don't have money, that is, but it's that people are unable to be productive, go out of their house. They're not able to ultimately do anything that was so the sort of patterns of consumption that so much highlighted the 1920s were basically impossible for people that weren't taking in any money whatsoever, right? So basically, because the traditional forms of relief, like the Federal Reserve, weren't able to accommodate this massive need for relief, Hoover ends up getting blamed for not acting, even if he was actually turning towards these earlier methods of relief. But there are some congressional actions to try to aid the unemployed, which Hoover vetoes. So it is fair to give him some criticism there that ultimately he had an opportunity to provide aid and he ended up vetoing it because he thought it was an unnecessary expansion of the federal government. One thing that was created actually slightly before the Depression, but very much kicked in with the attempt to try to bail out failing businesses was something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what that ultimately did was it made loans to banks, railroads, mortgage associations, and other businesses. And the idea was to kind of restore business confidence, get people to start spending their money again in these businesses, right? Because ultimately, without a federal government assistance, some of these businesses would continue to fail. So basically, you did have some success with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the sense that it did stop further bank failures, but it did not really do much to increase spending power, which was obviously a major element towards stimulating the economy. They needed to get more money into circulation. But basically, people didn't have enough confidence in the economy. They didn't have enough confidence in businesses. So people continued to avoid spending their money. And also, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation didn't really do anything to restore employment. So even if businesses were given aid, the general consumer was not. So that was also very problematic. And then I just have this little cheesy bubble kind of asking, to what extent might Hoover have completely been in denial of the extent to which the Depression was actually reaching every person's household, right? Or did he feel truly that this was a boom-bust cycle that would ultimately solve itself? Hoover oftentimes was kind of given the reputation that he told people to ultimately do nothing or to carry on business as usual and the economy ultimately would recover. This is an interesting theory, and there might be some truth to it because ultimately one of the reasons why the Depression got so bad was not the initial crash, but because so many people panicked afterwards and withdrew their money rapidly from the stock market. And of course, all the poor business practices that were in place, like buying on margin, just made everything worse, right? So maybe if less people withdrew all their funds from the stock market, which in turn, as we know, forced banks to recall loans and so on, maybe the Depression wouldn't have been as bad as it ultimately was. But nonetheless, Hoover, again, gets blamed for a whole lot of the problems that lead to the Depression, and his reputation is really epitomized by an event that happens shortly after he leaves office. And it's also during an election season, which is obviously problematic, right? Or it's shortly after an election season, rather. So in 1932, there is a group of World War I veterans, and they're called the Bonus Army. And they gathered together because for their service in World War I, they were guaranteed a bonus, so they were guaranteed some money to compensate for their services. But this bonus was not supposed to be redeemed until 1945. So basically, these soldiers made the argument that they needed the money sooner because of the economic problems with the Depression. And they decided to organize a protest. And so they got together and marched into Washington, demanding that they got their bonuses early. This protest got ugly fairly quickly. Police ended up shooting two of the veterans that were protesting and killing them. And then Hoover later on, because they were sort of disturbing the peace, ordered the veterans to leave Washington, right? So basically, you know, these people obviously don't get their bonus. You see that there's this example of a violent reaction against them. Of course, that sort of patriotism that was associated with the World War I effort is sort of crushed by this event. And also, people are very disgruntled with the way that Hoover treated these people who did their military service, expected a return, and ultimately two of them were killed, and then the others were turned away by the president. And so the bonus army was a major indicator that there needed to be some sort of change, that Hoover did not seem to be responding to the needs of the people. And so not surprisingly, in 1932, when Hoover was up for re-election, he is essentially scapegoated for all of the problems that were building up until 1932. It had been really almost 3 years, that is, since the stock market crash, and unemployment was continuing, businesses were continuing to fail, and people very much wanted to vote for someone who was the polar opposite of Hoover. They had had a whole decade of Republican presidents at this point, and they were ready for a change. And so we see with this map first how much of a landslide it truly was, both in terms of the popular vote, but even more so in terms of the electoral vote. FDR had a fairly prominent, there were two major reasons why he was elected. One of them is that he did have some significant political experience. He was the governor of New York before he was elected president. He was governor of New York up until the election, so that meant he was dealing on the state level with the problems of the Depression within New York State. And he put together what was called a brain trust, which was like a team of advisors that were trying to help him implement change in New York. And he gained a good reputation for his strategies to combat the Depression in New York. So people thought that he did have the experience to try to bring those reform efforts to a national level. And another reason why he was elected was probably because of his name, Roosevelt, right? He was a cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, who obviously was a very reputable president for enacting reforms during the Progressive era. So even though Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican and FDR was a Democrat, that name association still got him somewhere. And then arguably the fact that this isn't something that was actually very public, by the way, but when he was younger, early in his political career, FDR contracted polio, a very contagious disease at the time, which now is easily taken care of by vaccines. But the argument also, you could say, is that the fact that he was able to overcome polio kind of shows that he had this personal understanding of struggle and hardship. Even though he came from a wealthy background, just the fact that he was sort of dealing with a physical disability could certainly give him that kind of character and strength needed to deal with a problem as bad as the Depression. And when he takes office, he very quickly, sort of epitomizes the idea that hope and change and relief are coming. His inaugural speech, one of the most famous quotes from it is, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And in many ways, you'll see that FDR's programs don't necessarily get the U.S. out of the Depression, but rather they sort of restore that sense of confidence that was lost. They get people working, even if they're not getting them to make too much money. Ultimately, because getting people out of the house, just like when someone is, depressed in more of an emotional way, can certainly be a way that can help at least start to alleviate the problems of the Depression. So in any case, when FDR takes office in 1933, the first 100 days of his office are marked as one of the most important elements of really radically introducing reforms back to back. I mean, ultimately, he called Congress in for an emergency session for the first 100 days, and his goals were varied, but he wanted to restore confidence in the economy, get people out spending again. He wanted to try to revive industrial production, and with that, create jobs so that people were actually physically producing things again. He wanted to help agriculture recover because he recognized that there was a major problem in agricultural production and agricultural prices and the conditions of farmers with maintaining their property, mortgage foreclosures rather. So he really wanted to deal with that. So ultimately, we're going to see that actually, I just realized most of what I was going to say. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, so one of the first things that he does is he declares what's called a bank holiday, which was 4 days long. And basically what he did was he closed down all of the banks in the country, right? So for 4 days, banks could not have any transactions whatsoever. I think the only thing you could do was get change, right? But you couldn't deposit or withdraw any money. And while he did that, he was also working on drafting bank legislation to try to, ultimately try to weed out the banks that were failing with the banks that were more solvent. And so the result of that was something called the Emergency Banking Act. And what that did was it reopened banks that were deemed solvent. The ones that were not, the federal government granted aid to. Right? So basically, when the Federal Emergency Banking Act was passed, the idea was that when the banks reopened after the end of the holiday, people should have more faith in putting their money in it because the government had actually determined which banks were safe in terms of where you could keep your money. And he sort of helped people understand what he was doing with the Emergency Banking Act by getting on the radio. And he did this many, many times. This was just the first time he did it. He issued his first fireside chat right after that, which was basically where he got on the radio and spoke to the American people. You could say it's very similar to a State of the Union address, although the fireside chats happened much more frequently. And it was new because the previous presidents in the 1920s, none of them had been very vocal or communicative with their constituents in the way that Hoover was. He very much wanted to be transparent and talk with his population to make sure that they understood that the government was actively doing something to try to solve the economic crisis. And so basically his first fireside chat, his purpose was to say, we're taking all these steps, we declared this holiday, and in turn, we've filtered out the banks that are failing with the banks that are solvent, right? So now you know that the banks that are open are banks that you can put your money back into, right? So basically what a fireside chat was meant to do was to reinstill confidence with the population so that they would put their money back into the banks, right? Within 2 weeks of this first fireside chat, it must have been working because people returned more than half of the cash that they were hoarding back into the banks. Excuse me. So basically, this first 100 days, which we will talk about in much more detail in the next series of videos, is going to be very much an example of government action in a variety of ways. And in many ways, we're going to see that it's much more monumental in terms of establishing jobs, getting people out of the house, and not so much actually making people wealthier. It's in some ways just as much of an emotional recovery as it was an economic one. So let's take a break here. We will start with the next video, which is going to highlight some of the key programs of FDR's 100 days.